You're listening to the Verbatim Word Podcast, where we seek biblical truth in a daily context. I'm Justin Gary. You're listening to the Verbatim Word Podcast, where we seek biblical truth in a daily context. I'm Justin Gary. 13 years and 2 months. That's the portion of our lives, on average, that we spend at work. Added together, if you worked nonstop, you'd spend more than 15% of your total life at work. It's no wonder we often feel like we are living for the weekend, when we can get a little bit of our time to do what we want, because much of the rest of our time, well, it seems like someone else or something else is in charge. In fact, the only thing in life we spend more time doing than working is sleeping. Most people spend on average 26 years total sleeping, and 7 years total trying to get to sleep. Probably because they are up late worrying about work, that's why they can't sleep. But of our waking hours, work is the boss. During the average 50 years that people spend in their work years, about 24% of that time, that's close to 1/4 of all that they do during those years, is spent at work. No one wants to be a slave to their job, but when we look at the statistics, unfortunately, much of our lives will be given over to the master that we call work. Now, if you love your job, 15% plus is not so painful, but if you dread your job, well, it can be a real drudgery, can't it? Well, love it or loathe it, it's no surprise that the Bible says something about how we should work, because it assumes that most of us will work in some capacity. And the statistics agree that this is true. We are looking at a portion in the book of Ephesians where Paul is encouraging the believers to live out their faith boldly and clearly in this God-rejecting world in which they lived, exhorting them to be imitators of God in all their spheres of influence, to walk in love, to walk in wisdom, to redeem the time, 100% of their time, because the days were evil. And the need to share Jesus in this world often takes place in the daily walk of life, in the context of the roles and relationships we have, before a world that is watching our every move and motivation. Previously, we looked at the home on this podcast, the godly home, as the primary place to live out our faith, and the roles that God has given to husbands and wives, a true testimony of the gospel, and one that requires us to walk in the Spirit in order to fulfill. We talked about children obeying, and the blessing God has for us as we learn submission and humility, which bleed over into other areas of our lives, including our walk with the Father as children of God. This time, we look at servants and masters, employees and employers, because, well, we will be at work a lot. More than at church, more than in Christian service, more than with our own families most likely, and unfortunately. And it's at work that we find what will likely be our primary mission field if we approach it from a biblical perspective. Let's move into Ephesians 6, beginning in verse 5. In Ephesians 6:5, we read, "Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling and sincerity of heart, as to Christ." In that church in Ephesus where this letter would be read, there would be many a bondservant. The word in Greek is doulos. It can mean a servant, a slave, an attendant, a bondservant. And in that time, the Roman Empire was full of those who would be called a doulos. In fact, estimates are anywhere from 6 million to 60 million. Some say that as much as half the population in a city like Ephesus may have been a doulos, a bondservant. That's because the term seemed to encompass so many variations. Many families hired household servants, a teacher for your children. It was an age where homeschool was the way to go. Before distance learning was a thing, you hired a tutor, and they were a doulos, contracted to your family to help bring up the kids. A nanny, an au pair, committed to you in your service. Others hired as your family's doctors, those who knew medicine. We see this in the New Testament that Luke was a physician, likely a bondservant serving the family of a man named Theophilus, which we see at the start of the gospel bearing his name and in the first sentence of the book of Acts, later on possibly accompanying Paul to tend to his health needs. And still others, household servants, stewards, much like Joseph was years before in Egypt, overseeing the goods and resources of the master, helping keep the master's business and household running smoothly. For many, being a bondservant was equivalent to employment, something you did in return for payment or for the future promise of payment. In fact, under Roman servitude, it was not uncommon for someone to sell themselves into being a doulos in order to pay a debt or for the promise of some gain in the future or just to improve their financial stability. Some families even included the bondservants in the will or even adopted them as they became so close with the family and helping to run the household. So, this concept of being a bondservant, a doulos, it's probably closer to our concept of being an employee, an employer, and not quite what we equate to slavery in the history of the Americas in particular, with the triangular trade, the Underground Railroad, the Emancipation Proclamation. Of course, there likely was that going on in the Roman Empire. Cruel men and women who took advantage of the cultural concept of bond servanthood, mistreating, disrespecting, and manipulating the law in their favor, since the law seemed to support that a slave was property and could be dealt with and done with as the master saw fit. So if you had a good master, that was fine. But if it was a cruel master, well, things were different, resulting in a slavery that is manipulated because of man is sinful and selfish and greedy. And while that slavery, unfortunately, has always reared its ugly head in our world and throughout history, not every servant relationship played out on that level. Throughout the Bible, we see the concept of bondservants, of doulos. Paul uses it as an illustration in Galatians 4, contrasting the limited freedoms we had prior to the new covenant, saying, "Now I say that the heir, as long as he is a child, does not differ at all from a slave, though he is master of all, but is under guardians and stewards until the time appointed by the father." Referring to this arrangement that many families had of a bondservant helping to raise the children, the very ones that could grow up to be their potential masters one day. Paul also wrote to the Corinthians, "Let each one remain in the same calling in which he was called. Were you called while a slave? Don't be concerned about it, but if you can be made free, rather use it. For he who is called in the Lord while a slave is the Lord's freeman. Likewise, he who is called while free is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of men. Brethren, let each one remain with God in that state in which he was called." In that case, some sold themselves into slavery for personal gain, often financial. Others sought to leave or run away in order to serve Christ, and Paul tells them twice to remain in their calling, servant or free, because as Christ's servants, he can and will use us anywhere, regardless of our place in society or any sort of caste system. We see the example of Onesimus, a slave who deserted and stole from his master Philemon. And Onesimus ends up in Rome, where Paul is, and gets saved. And Paul writes the letter to Philemon, actually writing it likely at the same time he's writing to the Ephesians under house arrest in Rome. And Paul sends Onesimus back to Philemon, back to his master, and encourages both of them now to live out those roles as brothers in Christ. In fact, Christianity did not necessarily seek to abolish this bondservant arrangement in society. Jesus came to the Roman Empire, of which up to half may have been slaves, and his focus was on abolishing sin and reconciling man with God, because then every other relationship would follow suit. So Christianity challenged and revolutionized how bondservanthood should take place, with love and respect and value for each and every life. It condemned the greed and the selfishness and any violence and cruelty, and required love within that arrangement, something that wasn't there before. And this brings us to a point. When we become a Christian, a follower of Christ, there's no part of our lives that Christ does not seek to redeem for his glory. He may not remove us from every situation. He may not change all of our circumstances. He may not set us free from every commitment. But he can and will transform us in those same circumstances and use those for his glory, or set us free from them so we might glorify him if he sees fit. I think of criminals who find Christ in prison, and they don't get to get out of jail just because they pray a sinner's prayer, but that becomes their place to grow in him and serve him, at least for the time being. Jesus longs to transform the culture, not always by revolution against the cultural norms, but always by the transformation and presence of spirit-filled believers, Christians placed strategically in society at all levels, either by circumstance or choices or practical arrangements or needs, and he begins to work there, right there, for his kingdom's purposes. So when Paul writes in verse 5, "Bondservants, be obedient to those who are your masters according to the flesh, with fear and trembling, in sincerity of heart as to Christ. The congregation at Ephesus understood. Up to half of them were in that position, bondservants. As the scroll from Paul was rolled out and the word to that church was read, a large portion of them, well, they were slaves. And the word to them was to be obedient, with honor and respect, in sincerity as to Christ. The key here is as to Christ. On the one hand, there was something in this for the servant himself. God uses our earthly relationship to teach us about our relationship with him. Using tangible relationships that we can see to understand more of our relationship with him, which can be hard to comprehend fully sometimes. We saw this in the husband-wife example in the last chapter. A submissive wife learning about trust, something we're called to do in our relationship with God. A leading husband called to love unconditionally, something we struggle with understanding of the heart of God. Practical, tangible parables, object lessons that help us understand who God is and who we are to be. And so, for the 50% of slaves and bondservants in that room, Paul said they could take advantage of their situation and learn as to Christ, learning the principle of authority, the humility of service, and the blessings of having a good master. What is God teaching you in life right now? And I don't mean in Bible study or in your small group or your devotion. I mean practically. What lessons is he teaching you through the circumstances and roles and relationships in your day-to-day life? If you really take a look, you will often see those things, patterns of lessons. Maybe it's patience, or your need to be humble, or challenging you to trust, or your need to be gracious, or the importance of speaking up for Christ. If you walk with Jesus, there is something right now he wants to show you, and most likely you're discovering that in your day-to-day life, not necessarily at church. To become a Christian means that we invite Jesus to be the Lord of our lives, submitting our lives to his purposes for his glory, to serve in his kingdom and to serve his people. We become, as Paul said many times about himself, bondservants of Christ with the perfect master, one who loves us and has our best interest in mind. And while the earthly arrangement with earthly masters may not have always been perfect, Paul said they could grow in their personal relationship with God, in the lessons they learned and applied at work each day. When Jesus is Lord, he becomes the Lord of our lives, every part of our lives. This means he is also the Lord of our work. Jesus doesn't take us from work when we get saved, at least not always, but we do take him to work with us when he is in our lives. Some companies, as an incentive to employees and to promote a positive culture, have Take Your Dog to Work Day. It's actually a thing now, June 25th of this year, 2021, or more officially, the Friday after Father's Day each June in the United States. It's Take Your Dog to Work Day. Apparently, it was started in 1999 by a group called Pet Sitters International, and they say this on their website. This annual event encourages employers to experience the joys of pets in the workplace for one fun summer Friday to support their local pet communities. Through the event, non-pet owners are able to witness the special bond their coworkers have with their pets firsthand and be encouraged to adopt a new best friend of their own. Did you see that? Did you catch that? The goal is so that those who don't have a dog will get one. They will see the bond, the relationship, and desire it too. It's missionary work for pet owners. Of course, cat owners need not be envious. Take Your Cat to Work Day falls the Monday after Father's Day. In 2021, that's on June 21st, if you want to mark your calendar. Back in the day, there was Take Your Child to Work Day, an effort to promote parent-child relationships, but also to create career awareness for kids. My parents apparently didn't get the memo that it was just a one-day thing to take your kids to work. We were always at work with our parents. My mom had a cleaning business and my dad was a general contractor. And every day off for us from school seemed to be Take Your Child to Work Day and get them to work. I mean, we cleaned toilets and made beds and did windows and vacuumed floors for my mom's cleaning business. We picked up nails and moved lumber and made dump runs for my dad's construction business. My parents had rental properties. I have mowed so many lawns in my life. My parents took Take Your Child to Work Day to the extreme. They say we work 15% of our lives, as we saw earlier, but I think for the Gary kids, that number is probably closer to 25%, with the 10% bonus happening before our 18th birthdays. I joke and I jest, and my siblings will all agree that it was one of the best things for us all, since we all still work very hard to this day. But the point that Paul is making is this. If we can see some value in taking our dog to work or our kids to work once in a while, we're to take Jesus to work every single day, clocking in with Jesus and clocking out with Jesus, and understanding that no matter what earthly authority is placed over me, that I ultimately serve Jesus Christ. And as I take him with me to work, other people will see that and be envious and desire the exact same thing that I have. And that my submission to him would infiltrate every single sphere of my life. He goes on in verse 6 and describes how bringing Jesus to work will affect things. He says, "Not with eye service as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart." The realization here is that being a Christian should work powerfully and profoundly in two areas of my life: in my heart and attitude, and in my actions. Jesus does not leave either untouched or unaddressed. So these bondservants, now that they were serving Christ in addition to their masters, he was calling them to a higher standard, to serve God in and through their earthly roles, because Jesus had purchased that part of their lives too. Now, this is huge. As a Christian, I no longer have a job to put food on the table. I have a calling to serve Jesus in and through that vocation that puts food on my table, not just to work for work's sake, but because God has placed me there. And a responsibility to seek his will, asking him, "Jesus, how do you want me to do this? How do you want me to use this? How do you want me to respond in this? How do you want me to decide in this situation?" And to seek and to do the will of God from the heart. And in the context here, the will of God for the bondservants was to obey and serve as unto Christ. Paul exposes a common approach to work when he writes, "Not with eye service as men pleasers." It's pretty typical to work harder when the boss is around or when we're being watched. But when the cat's away, the mice will play, right? And then when the boss shows up, it's all hands on deck. That's eye service, doing it to be seen and for reward only when it serves you. That goes against the very expectations and needs of the employer, one who is paying and trusting you that you will do their work for them when they cannot be there. They expect that you will stand in their place or better and keep the same level of productivity consistently. That's the arrangement. Being a substitute teacher in schools is not the most thrilling job. When there's a sub, teachers usually leave lessons plans that have students using the textbook to do a worksheet or watching a film or something that requires very little input from the sub. When the sub is on duty, it's not exactly a scene from Dead Poets Society, with students experiencing huge breakthroughs, standing on their desks saying, "Oh, Captain, my Captain," in response to the substitute's valuable input into their lives of education. Well, one day at work, we had a sub, and apparently the job was not stimulating enough for him. And as the students worked on their busy work left by the teacher, they heard deep breathing coming from the teacher's desk where the sub sat. The sub had fallen asleep. Deep asleep, with a classroom full of students. Sitting in the teacher's chair, the sub was out. So the students told on the sub. In fact, the principal came, and all the while the sub slept through the entire thing. The principal actually had all the students get their book bags and leave the classroom quietly, and the substitute was still asleep. It wasn't until the room was clear and the door was closed that the principal woke up the sub and, of course, chewed the sub out before firing the sleeping beauty. Talk about sleeping on the job. As Christians, we're to work differently, to work as unto Christ, not to just do it when we're being watched or when someone's looking in on us, but at all times. His eye is upon us at all times. The believer should be a better worker, and the testimony should be clear, having integrity in how we work, making the most of our time, bringing the most profit for our employers, being the most trusted with the company's resources, representing the company in the best light at all times. Having integrity to work as unto the Lord, regardless of who's watching us or when we're being watched. And when you do this, you are a witness for Christ, because that is not how much of the world does their work. When God called us off the mission field, I knew that our next season would have me working full time, which was pretty intimidating, to be honest. I mean, I had worked before for sure. Again, my parents gave us plenty of work opportunities growing up, and they did pay us too, by the way. And then there were the part-time jobs in high school and college, and the internships and work study arrangements where I had to be at work in college. But right after college, I went in the mission field, and that was a different kind of work. My days and weeks were full for the most part, but it wasn't the traditional work arrangement. So moving back to the United States in my mid-30s, it would be the first time I worked a full-time job under the eyes of an employer. and I was kind of nervous about it. And in that time, the story of Joseph in Genesis became an important area of scripture for me. As I watched this young man of great promise go through some challenging seasons of demonstrating faithfulness and humility. And in those passages, I saw some insights into this man's great success. It says about Joseph in Genesis 39, starting in verse 2, the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man. And going on, and his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all he did to prosper in his hand. So it was from the time that his master had made him overseer of his house and all that he had, that the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. And the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. He could look back at his books, he could look back at his profit margin, and it all coincided with when Joseph entered the picture. Do you see the pattern? Joseph took the Lord to work every day. The Lord was with him. Joseph, the only worshiper of Jehovah in all of Egypt, most likely. And there was a marked difference, something that did not go unnoticed. And even when things go wrong at Potiphar's house, when Joseph is accused of inappropriate advances toward his master's wife, and Joseph ends up in prison wrongfully, this pattern continues in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hands all the prisoners who were in the prison. Whatever they did there, it was his doing. The keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. In both cases, there was no doing it with eye service just to please men. There was a marked difference between this man and the others there to choose from. That's the kind of opportunity that God gives us daily in our roles as employees, to witness for Christ, to do it with the Lord, and not just be by speaking up for him by the water cooler or finding opportunities to witness with a gospel tract or presentation, but by simply doing all things as unto Christ and having Christ with us at work every day. When we can approach our 9 to 5 in this way, walking in fellowship with Jesus and filled with the Spirit Monday through Friday, there is a blessing. As Paul writes in verses 6 through 8, doing the will of God from the heart, with goodwill, doing service as to the Lord and not to men, knowing that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. God blesses faithfulness. And that's not just about being faithful in spiritual spheres, but faithfulness is an attribute of God, and it is blessed in whichever realm God calls us to be faithful in. Don't underestimate the importance of being faithful. What has God given you to be faithful with? What time or opportunities or relationships or gifts or abilities are you supposed to be faithful with right now? What positions or spheres or people or teams or resources are you entrusted to be faithful with? What callings or finances or platforms or possibilities are you to be faithful over? There is a blessing in being faithful. This blessing and goodness that comes from God when we're faithful in whatever he has called us to do. I remember one of my first teaching assignments, I had to teach personal financial literacy to a bunch of high school students. It was definitely a challenge. First of all, I didn't know what a lot of the concepts were because I had lived overseas. And so a lot of this was foreign concepts to me. I had to look up what was a credit score. I actually have one of those. And so every day I was preparing these lessons and preparing them. And I felt like the Lord said, do it as unto me. Make these the best lessons. Now, before that, there had been another teacher, and that teacher had a lot of things on their plate. So this was just kind of an extra class that they did. And there wasn't much going on, and there wasn't a lot of expectation to film this class. But I said, if I'm going to teach this, I'm going to do this as unto the Lord. I'm going to do this the best way I can. So I put so much time in my lessons. I developed the best PowerPoints, analogies. I put so much work into that class. I was being faithful in what I'd been given, even though I was not really thrilled to teach that class at first. And you know what? I really began to love it. And God began to bless that faithfulness in simple, small ways. For example, there was a local credit union that began a competition. And this competition was to encourage teachers to teach financial literacy and to develop lessons for financial literacy. So each year you could submit one lesson that you had taught in class, and they would judge amongst those lessons, and they would award the ones who had done it best. Well, that first year, I had only been teaching a couple months, but I had committed that I was going to be faithful in this thing that had been given to me. I came in second place, got a little bit of money for myself and for the school as well. Well, the next year I kept working on it, and I submitted another lesson plan, something I had taught in class. And that time I won, being named the Financial Teacher of the Year in the entire state of Oklahoma that year. So the next year I applied again. And guess what? I won again. This actually went on. It became kind of a joke. I think I won that award 4 or 5 times, being called the Oklahoma State Financial Teacher of the Year because of these lessons I was doing. And I was doing nothing in addition. I was simply doing what I was doing in class, but I was doing it unto the Lord. And to me, it was a simple reminder of, Lord, Justin, it doesn't matter what you're doing. If you're pastoring on the mission field, if you're teaching financial literacy to high school students, if you do it as unto me, if you do your best, I will bless it. And the blessing came for us in a financial way because as 2 new teachers in the state of Oklahoma who came off the mission field with no savings, we could use that money every year. And even our school, they got some money as well, which was a blessing to them. But God is faithful. He gives us his goodness when we're willing to be faithful, even in the small things. And sometimes in the world eyes, it seems like this isn't going to pay off. This isn't lucrative. This isn't worth my time or my energy. But if God has called you to do it, be faithful in those little things. The blessing will come. As Paul writes there, when we do it unto the Lord and not unto men, we should know that whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord, whether he is a slave or free. It doesn't matter what God has asked us to be faithful with. It's the understanding of who has asked us to be faithful with it that is key. Remember the parable of the talents in the Gospels? Each received a different number of talents to hold on to until the master returned. After a long time, the Lord of those servants came and settled accounts with them. So he who had received 5 talents came and brought 5 other talents, saying, Lord, you delivered to me 5 talents. Look, I've gained 5 more talents beside them. His Lord said to him, Well done, good and faithful servant. You were faithful over a few things. I will make you ruler over many things. Enter into the joy of your Lord. What has the Lord called us to be faithful with? And you might be saying, oh, but Justin, it's hard to remain faithful. Of course it is. It's an attribute of the Spirit. Faithfulness is not in us naturally. It's a fruit of the Spirit, which means to be faithful in that area. We need Jesus. Jesus gave it to you to be faithful in, but you can't fulfill that unless you invite him into it. And oftentimes areas of faithfulness are testing grounds for more the Lord might have for us. As Jesus summed up in another parable, he who is faithful in what is least is faithful also in much. And he who is unjust in what is least is unjust also in much. Therefore, if you have not been faithful in the unrighteous mammon, who will commit to your trust the true riches? I've spoken to young people who really desire to serve the Lord. To them, serving in ministry is the highest calling, and it can be, if that is what God has called you to do. But the highest calling is to be faithful in whatever God has given you right now in this season. That is what God desires and requires above all else. And then what he does is when he is ready and he sees we are ready, he opens doors that we could never force open. And it happens so naturally and brings him all the glory. Pay attention to Joseph's story. He stayed faithful in that prison, and in one day, in a matter of hours, he was called upstairs to interpret a dream, a gift he had been faithful to use where he had been there in the prison. And he was second in command over the entire land within a few hours. It was not an opportunity, a position that he sought or strived for. Heck, he didn't even submit a resume. And yet that is where God wanted him to be, a new place for him to be faithful. And that faithfulness that had been tested in prison, the entire world at that time would benefit in the lean years to come because Joseph had been faithful unto the Lord. And to the masters in the room, those who were over the servants, Paul finishes this section with these words in verse 9. And you masters, do the same things to them, giving up threatening, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there's no partiality with him. The masters were to be faithful too, faithful with the authority and influence that they had to lead as unto the Lord, in humility and representing God in their positions, not ruling as the Gentiles, but as the people of God, true servant leaders. But Jesus called them to himself and said to them, you know that those who are considered rulers over the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. Yet it shall not be so among you. But whoever desires to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever of you desires to be first shall be slave of all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many. It doesn't matter if I'm a master or a servant. As a Christian, we serve Christ in whatever position he's called us to be in. And in serving Christ, we are called to serve others from whatever position he has me in currently. For the masters, the key to being effective in their authority was recognizing that they too were under authority. Good leaders know how to follow. They do not always need to be in charge. They can be a team player too. They can submit to others too, because good leaders know what it's like to lead and how hard it can be. So they follow differently, with the strong ability to support, because they know it can be lonely at the top. Paul reminded these leaders in Ephesus, knowing that your own master also is in heaven, and there is no partiality with him. At the foot of the cross, we are all equal. It doesn't matter who's in charge, what titles we have, because in the end, our Father in heaven is in charge, and we are all servants in his household and whatever roles he has for us for the time being. But one day we will serve him together, all of us servants in the palace of a great king. And he, our master in heaven, he knows what it is like to take the lowest place. He who knew no sin became sin for us, taking our place. The master becoming the servant. As Paul wrote to the Philippians, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ Jesus, who, being in the form of God, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but made himself of no reputation, taking the form of a bondservant and coming in the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even the death of the cross. Therefore, God also has highly exalted him and given him the name which is above every name, that the name of Jesus every knee should bow, of those in heaven, of those on earth, and of those under the earth, and that every tongue should confess that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. The suffering servant becoming the mighty king, faithful to do what was needed each step of the way. May God fill you and bless you this week as you press in to understand and know his calling on your life, as you depend on him to guide you and fill you for all he has asked you to do. And may he receive the glory as you faithfully serve him, as you serve others, wherever he has you in life right now.